Hello and welcome back to this chapel on this luminous Easter day. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, Romantic Christianity, and some of the ideas that are contained in it. Because this is something that's very close to me, to my own way of thinking, my own system of belief, if you wish, because I am a believer, a priest, a Christian priest, and so I do have my own life as well as my life in the church to which I belong. So the church is something that's very, very important for me. But also there is another element, there is another dimension. And in this book I begin by describing some of my feelings and experiences as a young boy of 12 on holiday in Portugal, facing an Atlantic storm that was coming in August. Of course, I wasn't in a boat. I was on the land, so in a safe situation, but looking out towards the sea and feeling a great sense of wildness and joy, and a sense of communion with this wild weather coming in from the ocean. And I was also very fascinated by Jules Verne and his story 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, this rather mad figure of Captain Nemo and his submarine, the Nautilus, and he went round the world running warships and sinking them and killing their crews, and but there was something for me that not so much by destroying other people's lives, but there was the anger of that man that I found quite striking at that age of 12. Also, another thing that marked me very profoundly was Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, that portrays and describes the attempted invasion by Napoleon of Russia, and in the end it was the Tsar who won the war between the two powers and preserved his country intact. But there are certain feelings of anger. But anger can be something that's very unhealthy too. It can be something very healthy, it can be something very good, and it also can be something very unhealthy, and that can bring us to great trouble. Some of you may know about this book that I wrote, Romantic Christianity, which is more a series of reflections rather than a scholarly work. And I began with a preface describing some of my own experiences. Where did Romanticism begin? Well, I think it's something that's been in man's psyche for the whole of his history. Sometimes it came to the fore, and sometimes it went into the background. What is usually referred to as Romanticism is the reaction to the French Revolution, where the French Revolution destroyed what it tried to create. It tried to destroy religion and belief in order to promote reason and science. But yet, it destroyed the very thing it tried to promote. And so after the French Revolution there were a number of artists, poets, even scientists who felt that reason alone was not enough. We have imagination, we have emotions, not just intellectual faculties to be able to think about things of natural science or mathematics or logic, but we also have experience, and we also have an imagination that creates. This was something that was very important in the 19th century with the profusion of poetry and music and architecture, the Gothic revival, the very restoration and revival of Christianity in the 19th century. We had great men like Don Guéranger and Montalembert, the liberals, and then we had the German idealists, beginning with Kant and Goethe and Novalis and Schelling and Schleiermacher and many others in the late 18th century, the early 19th. And I'm very impressed, especially by the Germans, rather than by the English romantics, who tended to be a little bit too anti-Christian for my liking. I'm thinking particularly of Shelley and Keats. Keats was quite an unruly young man who finally went to Italy and died of tuberculosis. And Shelley, he went sailing in some very bad conditions in the Mediterranean Sea, and he was shipwrecked and lost at sea. They were very tumultuous people. Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, because she, together with Byron and one or two others, they went on holiday in a big house on the side of Lake Geneva in that awful summer, or year without a summer of 1816. And they wrote horror stories and entertained each other. And Christianity demands a certain discipline as well as inspiration. So I think a lot of these romantic people can teach us an awful lot of things. So the Romanticism, as far as I see it, Christian Romanticism, goes back a lot more than the late 18th century. I think particularly of Jacob Boehme, who was in the 17th century, who was a humble cobbler of Koblenz in Germany, and he was a mystic and wrote some very mysterious things. I have some translations of his works into English because my German is not good enough to be able to follow that kind of thing. And his writings, quite a lot were translated by George MacDonald, the same one who translated Novalis, Friedrich von Hardenberg, this young man here who lived in Germany from the late 18th century, but also succumbed from tuberculosis. Probably giving a death similar to what many of the people now suffering from COVID-19 die from. The lungs collapse, they fail, the body fails, and they expire. Coming back to the early Romantics, as I would call them, I would class Johann Sebastian Bach among them, although he lived in what we would call nowadays the Baroque era. But he was, if you read the texts of some of his cantatas, his church cantatas throughout the liturgical year, you will find that many of them are very, very mystical and follow very closely the ideas expressed by Jacob Boehme. I've also been, as a student, very inspired and influenced by Vladimir Soloviev from Russia, Nikolai Berdyaev, who was exiled from Russia, came to live in France, and wrote many books in his native Russian and in French. And most of these books have been translated into English and can be found. I'm also very impressed by a lesser-known character, but a Frenchman, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who lived in the 18th century and died in the early 19th. So he fell very much into the Romantic era. And he was a very devout Christian, but had some very unconventional ideas. So reading some of these people have enabled me to understand some of my own feelings about Sehnsucht, meaning the inconsolable yearning, desire, the man of desire, l'homme du désir, as Saint Martin would call it. And there was also another feeling that you would find among the Romantics, Weltschmerz. Interesting that these words would be German words, because Romanticism was far more advanced in its ideas and feelings in Germany than either in France or in England or anywhere else in the northern European countries. So the French Revolution must have been a horrible time, quite apart from the number of people who lost their heads on the guillotine because they didn't agree with the fanatical Jacobins, les Jacobins of Robespierre, the terror led eventually to the Napoleonic Wars, and the whole of Europe was set alight especially by this incredibly ambitious man Napoleon, but at the same time he was a great organizer. The French codes of law are second to none, because a lot of the old laws were swept away by the revolution, and so Napoleon had a clean slate on which to work, and produced the Napoleonic Code, which is still the basis for French law to this day. So we will find in Romanticism some aspirations to the restoration of Christianity, as well as those who were opposed to Christianity and sought another philosophy of life. So I would trace Romanticism not only back to Jacob Boehme and William Blake. William Blake was, of course, an amazing fellow. He didn't only write Jerusalem, that hymn that makes us feel all patriotic when we sing it to the tune of Parry, and did those feet in ancient time. I remember from school we learnt it by heart and we sang it in the chapel. But there were some dark words in that, the dark satanic mills, and was Jerusalem builded here among those dark satanic mills. What were the dark satanic mills? not necessarily the place where people had to work because of the Industrial Revolution, and they worked in very nasty and dangerous conditions with those machines, weaving cloth and catching people's hands and even killing them sometimes. But also the dark satanic mills were no less than the universities of Oxford and Cambridge that were teaching reason to the exclusion of everything else, including faith and imagination. William Blake, he was an amazing fellow. Maybe he suffered from psychiatric illness. It's difficult to tell. There's one thing that's very firm in my mind is not to try to diagnose a man who's been dead for hundreds of years. You don't diagnose the dead because they've gone on to other things. But also he was a mystic. He painted beautiful things, and he was also a poet. Some of the other English poets. And the interesting thing is, I mean, I trace this tendency back to Gnosticism. But there's Gnosticism and Gnosticism. Very often right-wing American thinkers classify Gnosticism as what is behind modern or postmodern nihilism and the revolt against the established order. No, it's not so much that. Gnosticism was, I would say, something like the Western equivalent of Buddhism. It's a philosophy of life, and sometimes led man to some very to some extremes, some very dangerous extremes. For example, the dualism between matter and spirit, the dualism between the good God and the demiurge, the bad God, who was the creator, according to some of the more radical Gnostics. But there were also more, shall we say, orthodox movements led by Saint Clement of Alexandria and Origen, and they were clearly influenced by Gnosticism, but less so than some of the other Gnostics. They were more influenced by the mainstream Christian tradition, and in as far as they are orthodox and they give a priority to Christian teaching, they become much more interesting. And indeed, Nicholas Berdyaev says, had the Gnostics won the day, Christianity would never have been victorious. It would have been turned into an aristocratic sect. Of course, aristocracy doesn't necessarily mean lord this and that and lady so and so, but it comes from the Greek word aristos, meaning best. And the thing about the church is that the church is for everyone, not only those who are of a spiritual elite, perhaps who are mystics and are very advanced in spiritual life, but the church is also for the ordinary people who need something, who need something to give them a purpose in life. And maybe they might not be able to assimilate very much, but they can assimilate something. The other thing that is very interesting about Gnosticism is the theory of the three classes of people, between the pneumatics, that's to say the mystics and the people living at a very high level, the psychics who are literatists, intellectuals, good people, but who were matter of fact, lived by common sense. And then you have the Heiligs, the lewd people who lived only for pleasure and self-satisfaction, and for money and for material things, and nothing else. Well, it's a big temptation to want to divide humanity into these three castes, but Gnosticism went very much further. I'm almost convinced that people like Jean Calvin, Calvin as we call him in English, would have been influenced by this kind of thinking, suggesting that men can't change, people can't change. They are either predestined for heaven or for the fires of hell, and this goes against our intuitions to promote the cause of humanism, of Christian humanism. This very pessimistic view that you would find also in French Jansenism in the 17th century. I remember at school hearing the poem of Robert Burns, the Scottish, the stern Scottish Calvinist, who wrote Holy Willie's Prayer, in which a religious hypocrite contrasts his self-righteousness with babies gnashing their gums in hell. What a horrible idea! But this is the negative side of Gnosticism, whereas there is also a very positive side, turned much more towards the light. Well, in my book, I traced the liturgical movement, the 19th century restoration of Christianity, which you will find in my blog. I've written quite a lot of articles about Dom Odo Cazal, who was a German monk at Maria Laach, and he died from a stroke as he did what I did yesterday, as to say, was preparing to sing the Exultet in exactly the same place where I'm sitting now. I was facing the east and I sung the Exultet. And Dom Cazal had a stroke or a heart attack or something like that, and dropped dead, and passed into the mysteries. I can think of worse ways of dying. He wrote especially about Christ as a mystery. This is something that's very important about the liturgy, and this also comes from Romanticism, that we see more than just rational theology like the Jesuits, the scholasticism of the Jesuits. The mystery, the liturgical mystery, brings into our presence not only the Passion of Christ, Pascha Passione, the transitus, the destructive angels, and the passing over the houses marked by the blood of the Lamb. But there is a true transitus. There is a true war, a battle between life and death. that ends up with the victory of life over death. And so it is not only the crucifixion of Christ and the scourging and the torments he suffered by those sadistic Romans who scourged him and crucified him, and then with all the buffeting and accusations by the high priest, clearly somebody who had not the slightest understanding of Christ's mission in this earth. It was not only the passion, but also the resurrection. And it doesn't finish even today. We go on towards the ascension. Then we go on towards Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Ghost on the apostles, and the symbol of the flames of fire. And then we go through the church year to Advent, which not only announces the coming of the incarnate Word in Christ, but also warns us or signals to us the parousia, the end of days, the end of this world. This world will end one day. It might end much sooner. In any case, for each one of us, it will end with our bodily death and our transitus, our passage from this world to another world that we know nothing about. We can't imagine it, but it exists. So this is the real sense of the liturgy and the restoration of the liturgy between the period of Don Guéranger and the Romantics, and really up to about the 1940s and 1950s, with the work of Louis Bouillet, an extraordinary French theologian and a liturgical scholar. I have an incredible amount of esteem for Louis Bouillet. The Renaissance is very, very important in this development of the inner man. Esoteric Christianity. Christianity is both exoteric, that's to say the plain teaching of Holy Scripture, preaching and going to church and experiencing the liturgy, but it's also something much deeper. It can be to various degrees of depth and insight, and that is esoteric Christianity, which is not necessarily occultism, because the word occult just means hidden, but very often occultism can mean something very nasty and something very dangerous and unhealthy, but it can also mean a degree of knowledge, spiritual knowledge, that can be good for those who are prepared for it, but can also be very bad for those who are not prepared. This is what happened with the Nazis when they got hold of some ideas about esotericism. It led them to believe that they had the right to go killing millions of people in concentration camps and bombing their cities to hell. So I move on in my book through the description of Burma and his notion of the Ungrund, which was an attempt to understand to some extent the mystery of evil. That God himself lives the same conflict between light and darkness as we do. That is an idea that is quite anathema to many Christians, because we are used to thinking of God as all goodness and all love. Of course he is all good and call love. But God also suffers from what certain science fiction films call the dark side. God does have a dark side, as we all have, and this is something that's very apparent in the Old Testament. The Gnostics tried to explain that away by saying that God had a kind of shadow God who had all the bad and angry feelings in him. But we as Christians, we don't believe that there are two gods. There is only one God. But that God suffers from the same passions, the movements of our spiritual life within us. That's a very, very interesting idea, but it's something that has to be deepened, something that has to be studied, something that has to be meditated, and a very brave attempt to understand how we can find ourselves in the midst of a war, or as we are right now in the middle of a pandemic and seeing thousands of people dying of strange pneumonia and other diseases and being put on ventilators, and the suffering. Of course, I don't work in a hospital, I'm far from it all, but I see it on the internet. I see the doctors and the nurses. I see the nurses lying in the corridors of the hospital because they're absolutely exhausted. It's very difficult to find an explanation of why this suffering happens. But I think Burma probably came very close to it, as did some of the later romantics like William Blake and oh dear, the name has gone for the moment. Swedenborg, a very interesting Swedish mystic who also had some very strange ideas and set up a kind of church. He apparently had revelations. People do, it sometimes happens. And I think some of these people really do have experiences that most of us don't have. So I come to the chapter Christian Romanticism. I remind the reader that it was a reaction from an era of spiritual dryness that was the 18th century rationalism, Descartes, the idea that we were just machines and that everything works according to exterior laws. But if we are humans, if we have imagination, creative imagination, then we are much more. We do have bodies, and we do have things that in some ways resemble machines. We have instincts like dogs and cats and cows and every other animal, every other species of animal, but we have something that is added to that, which is imagination and spirit. And so I wrote quite a lot about the arts and crafts movement, but also about the 19th century Catholic and liturgical restoration. I find an incredible coincidence between the Oxford movement and people like Don Guéranger and Lamennais and Montalembert over here in France, almost exactly at the same time. But those people were probably not in touch with each other. but there's something very, very strong that fueled these movements. There's one very interesting piece of work that you will read about also in my blog. Was this young man with long hair, Novalis, Friedrich von Hardenberg, wrote a kind of parable called Die Christenheit oder Europa, and it seemed like a kind of exercise in nostalgia by French traditionalists. What the great monarch and the great pope, and let's get back to the grand old days. But no, not at all. It was a dream. It was a work of the imagination. It was an appeal to another view of the Middle Ages, not necessarily what the Middle Ages really were, in terms of no healthcare and people having short and brutal and painful lives, but there was the spirit that built the cathedrals, and that the troubadours and the Goliaths and many other movements in the Middle Ages, as in every other age of humanity. I mentioned the German idealists like Kant and Fichte, and among those idealists there were romantics like Schlegel and Novalis. There needed to be a more human element in these thoughts about what reality is, what is truth. Do we possess truth? Do we have a truth and then impose it on everyone else by the sword if necessary? Or is the truth something that we are all yearning for, that we are all aspiring towards? Novalis was a mathematician and a scientist. He was also a lawyer. He was a very talented man, and gave a lot of thought to this idea of truth. What is reality? How do we know things? And so idealism is almost an antithesis of realism. What is real? Is reality produced by our consciousness? This is a theme that often comes in with some very serious scientists and quantum physicists, that they consider consciousness rather than matter. So this is one thing that gives me a lot of interest in German idealism and German Romanticism. Well, Romanticism was very criticised even in its own time. The French critic Émile Faguet wrote that, I have the English translation here, the basis of Romanticism is a horror of reality and a desire to escape from it, to liberate oneself from the real by means of the imagination, to liberate oneself again through solitude and retiring into the sanctuary of personal feeling. It's an interesting criticism, a very valid criticism from the point of view of a materialist or a realist, that's to say those who follow the metaphysics of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. The idea of reality being independent of the subject, where thought in the idealists and also some of our modern scientists shows consciousness as creative of reality. And that is a very, very radical idea. It was the consciousness of God that created, that made things real, as it were. And were he to withdraw that consciousness, everything we know would disappear, would cease to exist. And this is something that this is part of standard Christian thought, that creation is not only a past act by which God created the earth and the animals and the sea and we humans, but it's a continuous process. It is God's consciousness and also our collective consciousness that creates. It also creates art. This is the essential thing about the romantic imagination. It's a creative force. You'll find a lot written by Nicolas Berdyaev about this. So I go on beyond this different way of thinking about reality and truth, that there is quite often a feeling of nostalgia for the past, the Middle Ages, this chapel that you see that I installed in this old garage 12 years ago. And the inspiration is English medieval, but it's also the arts and crafts movement of the early 20th century, something that I'm very sensitive to. But we might be nostalgic about the beautiful and wonderful things of the past, but for the purpose of carrying them into the future. As I said, the revival of Catholicism in both the Church of England and in post-revolutionary France was a fruit of Romanticism, very much the opinion of Monsignor Andrew Burnham of the Ordinariate in England, and he asks himself what brought about this Catholic Restoration revival in the Church of England. And he says this: the answer, I think, is that what drove high churchmen, at least from the 19th century on, at least in part, was the Romantic movement. I heard Monsignor Burnham say this at a talk he gave at St Stephen's House in Oxford that I attended, I think it was last year, yes, I think it in 2019. And I was quite taken aback that such a sensible man would come up with such ideas, because he's an amazingly cultured man, and I have a lot of esteem for him. A very learned and very mature man who can be a great example for us all. The Gothic revival movement. You find hundreds of Victorian churches in England, some of poor quality, some of architecture and building, but others are absolutely extraordinary. And so we come to our own times. I mentioned in my book Alan Jacobs, The Year of Our Lord, 1943, Christian Humanism in an Age of Crisis. And he describes the French philosophers Jacques Maritain and Simone Weil, and the English thinkers and poets T.S. Eliot, C.S. Lewis, and W.H. Auden, all in the chaos of World War II, the sheer suffering, the millions of dead, the bombing, the killing, the hatred, and yet the bitter sacrifice and determination of the Allied armed forces, who ended up winning at great cost. But this book answers the question of what would happen after the end of hostilities, which came in 1945 with the defeat of Germany, Nazi Germany. What would come afterwards? Would people be any more spiritual? What actually happened was largely we just became more materialist with the 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years that followed from 1945 up to about 1970. I very, very much remember the change of atmosphere between the 1960s, when I was a child, and the 1970s, when I was an adolescent. But something had changed. We'd become more materialistic. We were destroying beauty. We were throwing good things away and building our life on what was the most ugly, the most brutalist. I remember buildings of that period, the bus station in Kendal, my hometown, and it was a horrible building, horrible grey concrete that fortunately was demolished several years ago. I don't think it was replaced by anything better, but at least that horrible old building disappeared. So it's a long story of Romanticism. I recommend you can either buy my book or contact me by email or via a comment on my blog, and I'll send you a free copy by PDF file if you don't feel like buying the book. I would like to end this little talk, or this little ramble, by a poem by Novalis, and I will first of all I will read it in German, as I pronounce the language reasonably well, and I will read then I will read the translation by George MacDonald, who himself was an extraordinary man, an extraordinary Christian, a Calvinist pastor, and a poet. But I will first read it in the original German, and if any German speakers are listening, I hope they will forgive me for my faults of translation. Ich sage es jedem, dass es lebte und auferstanden ist, dass in unserer Mitte schwebte und ewig bei uns ist. Ich sah es jedem, ja, der sagte, es seinen Freunden gleich, dass bald an allen Orten tagt das neue Himmelreich. Jetzt scheint die Welt den neuen Sinn, erst wie ein Vaterland. Ein neues Leben nimmt man hin, entzückt aus seiner Hand. Hinunter in das tiefe Meer versank des Todes Grauen. Und jeder kann nun leicht und her in sein Zukunft schauen. Der dunkle Weg, den er betreibt, geht in den Himmel aus. Und wer nur hört aus seinen Rat, kommt auch in Vaters Haus. Nun weit auch keiner mehr allhier, wenn einst die Augen schließt. Von Wiedersehen, spät oder früh, wird dieser Schmerz versüßt. Es kann zu jeder guten Tat ein jeder frische Glühen, denn herrlich wird ihm dieser Saat in schönen Floren blühen. Es lebte und wird nun bei uns sein, wenn alles uns verlässt. Und so soll dieser Tag uns sehen, ein Weltverjüngungsfest. He lives, he's risen from the dead, to every man I shout. His presence over us is spread, goes with us in and out. To each I say, to each apace, his comrades telleth too, that straight will dawn in every place the heavenly kingdom new. Now to the new mind first appears the world a fatherland, a new life men receive with tears of rapture from his hand. Far into soundless gulfs of sea death's horror sank away. Now every man with holy glee can face his coming day. The darksome road that he hath gone leads out on heaven's floor. Who heeds the counsel of the Son goes in at the Father's door. Weeping no longer shall endure for him who shuts his eyes, for soon or late a meeting sure shall make the loss a prize. And now to every noble deed each heart can fresher glow, for many a fold the scattered seed in lovelier fields will blow. He lives, will sit down by our hearths, through all besides hath ceased. Therefore this day shall be the earth's rejuvenescence feast.